Today, my oral presentation is over the expedition of Lewis and Clark. In January of 1803, President Thomas Jefferson requested $2,500 for the westward exploration, made that request to Congress. And it was done in secret, but it was in order to expand the knowledge of the West, including making diplomacy with the Indians out west, exploring upwards of the Mississippi River, expanding the American fur trade, and hopefully finding the rumored waterway called the Northwest Passage to the Pacific Ocean. In May 1803, the Louisiana Territory was purchased from France, and this led to the finalization and approval of the exploration that was requested from Congress. The expedition started in 1804 and lasted through 1806. It was called Lewis and Clark's Expedition because it was led by Meriwether Lewis and William Clark. Lewis was President Jefferson's personal secretary, tasked with assembling the Corps of Discovery. He was a 29-year-old soldier and veteran of the Indian Wars, and he was a well-educated leader of men, so he was put in charge. He was known to be a little bit more on the gloomy side, a little sensitive, but the intellectual type nonetheless. He was sent to Philadelphia for 6 weeks to get a crash course on the sciences. He was naturally skilled at botany, but he also learned things like celestial navigation, medicine, and zoology, so he could help identify things along the way. William Clark was co-captain and equal to Lewis. He was actually superior to Lewis in the army, though, and he was also from Virginia, as was Lewis. He was 35 years old, but he was also known to be more amicable, agreeable, pleasant, and friendly compared to Lewis. And he was overall a lot luckier in love and in life. He was tasked as the main waterman, the main navigator, engineer, and of course map maker. The Corps of Discovery. They left up the Missouri River from St. Louis on May 14th, 1804 to the Pacific coast. Eventually they'll get there. They returned to St. Louis eventually. That date that they returned is September 23rd, 1806. And approximately 45 men started the journey. All in all, there was only one casualty. That casualty was actually the youngest member of the group, Charles Floyd. He died of appendicitis. Made up of soldiers. The Corps of Discovery was made up of soldiers, boaters, hunters, and they also traveled in 3 boats, one being a keel boat named The Boat, and 2 other boats, which were just small dugout boats. They traveled approximately 15 miles a day up the Missouri River. They were going upstream of a very big and strong river, so it did take them some time. Experiences that they had along the expeditions. They made many discoveries, including 178 plants from Lewis and 122 animals. These species were then, some were brought, some were only documented, but all of it was brought back and published into science. They also faced a lot of struggles and hardships. Those included dysentery, boils on their skin, abscesses from those, ticks, mosquitoes the size of flies, as well as snakes, abscesses, sunstroke, and other diseases and pests. One of the main goals, of course, was Indian diplomacy, so they were tasked with trying to trade, bring peace, and also informed Indians of the new American claim to territory. Different tribes have different reactions, but the first that they met were the Sioux people. The Sioux people, we will find out, are not too happy about their plans. This was the first tribe that Jefferson had mentioned, though, that he wanted to trade with. And he also wanted peace and diplomacy, but that would prove to be unsuccessful because the Sioux were known to be fierce warriors and overall a very powerful nation among the natives. But who are the Sioux? So the Sioux were known to be the pirates of the Missouri. They placed tolls on the river. the ford between the Missouri and the Bad River, which is also where they had met the Corps of Discovery on their route. The main reason that they probably met at that intersection with the men was probably for tolls, because that was a good way of making money off of people trying to pass through. They also had a lot of power over not only their own tribe, but a lot of tribes in the surrounding areas, as well as certain traders, European traders. So they had a lot of power, and they would prove to be quite a feat. Lewis and Clark tried to show the power, technology, weapons, dances, plans of trade, and including the entire territory. They wanted traders to be free to pass through the river. That did not go by so well with the Sioux, because they monitored the river, they tolled the river, and they felt threatened as middlemen to the river financially. They felt threatened by this proposal from Lewis and Clark to allow the traders to pass by. So what did they do? They were sick of their stuff, and so they planned an attack on Lewis and Clark and the Corps of Discovery. But luckily, they had somebody to inform them, and so they didn't have any lives lost, but it did lead to a 4-day ordeal fighting between the Corps and the Indians. One Indian tried to tie up the boat to prevent it from proceeding upriver, while the rest of the Indians were attacking the Corps from all sides of the river with bows and arrows. But the Indians, not having guns, were ultimately outgunned because the Corps had guns. And so they basically went into a firefight with one another until they were able to get upriver enough to make alliances with tribes away from the Sioux, so that on their return, they wouldn't have the same problems with the Sioux, basically. The alliances that they made were first with the Arikara tribe, which is known as an agricultural tribe with a lot of rich crops, and they were also very kind to incoming Americans and were very willing to trade with the men. The Mandan tribe was next. This is where they spent quite a large amount of their winter in passing. The population of the Mandan tribe was 5,000, but it was really about 5 tribes put together to protect themselves from the Sioux. So it was a pretty high population for the time. This is where they had also set up Fort Mandan, is what they had called it, named after the tribe. And it was the main trading grounds of the region. The Mandan were very, very intelligent and skilled traders, with the Europeans always trying to find the best deal out of them. During their stay, the men learned many customs, including squaws in recognition, and it was also common practice, out of respect, to trade sex with the wives of the tribe to traders in return for whatever they wanted, or just for respect. An interesting story about that is that the Mandan, they were just enthralled with Lewis's slave named York. They said that he resembled the bear, which was a sacred animal and spirit to the Mandan tribe. And that was because of his color and his size and his stature and everything. So being so enthralled by this black man, York, the chiefs oversaw their wives of the tribe having sexual intercourse with York, the slave, because they wanted to pass down the spirit of the bear to their offspring. So that was an even trade for both sides in their minds. And it was consummated in what they called the Earth Lodge. Beautiful. Also, the Mandan tribes had taught the men many games along with dances, and both groups would dance and perform together. All in all, they had a lot of fun with the Mandan tribe over the winter. And then next, they came upon the Hidatsa tribe. The Hidatsa tribe is where they met Sacagawea and her husband, Toussaint Charbonneau. They also spent some of the winter with the Hidatsa. But first, before I tell you about their winter with the Hidatsa, let me introduce to you the star female role of the expedition, Sacagawea, also known as Sacagawea, but I come to find out the Hidatsa call her Sacagawea in their language. So I will call her Sacagawea. She was a Shoshone, but she was stolen from her people and brought back to Hidatsa territory. She speaks both Hidatsa and Shoshone, and she was only 20 while she traveled with Lewis and Clark. Also, she had a baby the February of that winter that they were staying with the Hidatsa. She became a primary guide in their travel because she knew the territory and terrain that they were about to cross over from being kidnapped from the Rockies where her Shoshone tribe had lived. This will prove to be a very beneficial find. But in the winter, she had spent much of the time trying to teach Lewis and Clark about the tribes and about geography out west. And she overall was seen as a beacon of peace to the group, and because she had a baby in her arms and was an indigenous woman, she was very much a peace emblem in the eyes of many others than just a band of men. So that will, like I said, benefit them a lot in the long run. Toussaint Charbonneau was her husband. He was a French trader who spoke both French and Hidatsan and was hired by the group more so as a translator for Sacagawea and the men. But he also spoke French, so that came in handy in some cases as well. So he was basically a guide and a translator for their name, Sacagawea. After that, they finally set out on what is called the turning point of the expedition, where they really get their boots in the sand and they get their wheels rolling. So on April 7th, 1805, a small portion of the men take a keelboat back to St. Louis with a lot of supplies and materials that they had found to document to Jefferson and bring to him. And then the rest of the crew keeps moving forward. So that makes the crew now 33, with the division of a few and the inclusion of a couple. And so for almost 2 months, they travel upstream from the Hidatsa area. They go through all kinds of terrain, but none of it really sticks out, as a lot of it is flat compared to what they have yet to come upon, which is the Rocky Mountains. So they finally reach the Rockies on May 26, 1805, and by June 2nd, 1805, they were faced with a choice to go north or south at the fork of the river. And that fork took them many days to decide which direction to go. They decided to inquire on both routes, that which led to be inconclusive. And so while many thought that going north was the best idea, the captains overall decided to go south, and that was the right way, lucky for them. They reached what was called the Missouri Breaks, and that was where the Missouri broke off into a giant waterfall, also known as the Great Falls of the Missouri. So they, on June 13th, like I said, reached the falls, like many indigenous tribes had told them that they would before, on the right path. So they found the right path. But then they were faced with waterfalls. So how the heck are they gonna get up the waterfalls? Well, it was not a fun time. They made wagons with sails to try and take them upwind up the mountains. It was an 8-day trek, and now keep in mind, this is very craggy terrain, very broken terrain that's covered in cacti, and it is just unpleasant. Many men faint. It was just really hard on everybody. It took 12 days to get through. I would imagine it was quite a long 12 days. And To their surprise, it was not getting easier from there, but to find some ease, they first decided to take none other than Independence Day, the 4th of July, off, and they celebrated with what was remaining of the 120 gallons of alcohol that they brought with them. Priorities. But I'm glad that they got to have some fun dancing in the moonlight, because what was yet to come was no more fun than what had been before. So upon arriving to the Three Forks of the Missouri, which is the next step, they don't know which way to go. But luckily, Sacagawea recognized Beaver Head. Beaver Head Rock is what it's called, where she had verged off on the river from when she was stolen from her tribe. So she said it's either straight ahead to the west or the even more westward route. So they went the most westward route, and luckily they came upon a band of Shoshones. And would you guess it, the band of Shoshones was actually made up of and led by none other than Sacagawea's brother, Kamehameha. Sorry, I want to make sure I said that right for him. Kamehameha's brother led the pack of Shoshones that they had come across, and he had helped them get horses so that they could continue on their travels across the Rockies with some pack animals to help them carry all of the luggage that they had. But on that further travel, they had to cross the Rockies. And they soon reached the Continental Divide. To their disappointment, whenever Lewis climbed Lemhi Pass and looked over, he realized there was nothing left to see but more mountain ranges. He was hoping for something, maybe that Northwest Passageway that they were talking about that was supposed to be a waterway to the Pacific. Nay, they had run out of waterways to travel, and now they just had to go foot across these mountains, trekking. So he climbs atop the Continental Divide to see more mountain ranges, gets quite disappointed that he does not see that Northwest Passageway, and well, they just keep on going until they finally run into some Indians called the Flathead Indians. The Flathead Indians, they meet on September 4th, 1805. But the Flatheads took a while before they actually approached the band because they wanted to make sure that they knew what their intentions were. Also, they spoke Cilician, so whenever they came upon the band, there was quite a language barrier, but luckily, the Court of Discovery had a slave who spoke Cilician, and so, through a long chain of communication from one language to another language to another language to another language, from Cilician to Shoshone to Hidatsan to French to English, finally the messages were relayed from Cilician to English to Lewis and Clark to make decisions. Overall, the Flatheads were actually really nice, and they bartered for horses in exchange. They also suggested that they take the Lolo Trail further in their journey across the Rockies. The Lolo Trail was known to be a quick route, but it was not known to be an easy route. It was very sparse in game and was just a hard, treacherous trail all around. They got lost on the trail because there was snow all over it. There was a snowstorm because, they're in the Rockies where it snows more than it doesn't. And they had horses die. The horses they just bartered for, dead already, within less than 5 days. Actually, it was supposed to take 5 days to cross, but it took up to 8 days to get past the Lolo Trail because of the snow and getting lost on the route. And all of that being a lack of game and everything, they start starving because it takes longer than they anticipate. So they decide that they're going to cut up and cook up a horse, and they eat a horse because survival is what you gotta do. But it did end up being the quickest route, and in 8 days after the Lolo Trail, they finally came upon some plains, flat land. Thank you. After so many mountains, they come across the Nez Perce Nation, who fed the men, and they also exchanged horses Some of the horses that the men had, they had exchanged them for 5 cottonwood canoes with the Nez Perce, and they then take those canoes, travel the Clearwater and Snake Rivers down into the big old Columbia River. So big, in fact, that they thought that it was the Pacific Ocean. To their disappointment, yet again, the Pacific Ocean was a solid month away. So they continue to travel down the Columbia River, and on November 15th, 1805, they finally reached the Pacific Ocean, where they decide to set up camp at Fort Clatsop. That's somewhere in between Washington and Oregon, somewhere along that current day border. So they chose to stay between the Chinooks and the Clatsop Indians. The Clatsop, Fort Clatsop, makes sense. And both choices were not the best because both tribes had been deeply hardened by the Europeans that had come to trade and explore before Lewis and Clark and the Corps of Discovery. So it was a long winter. It was a long winter for them. They were literally trading things like buttons and like jewelry and like accessories and like small tiny things that they needed to survive for other things that they needed more to survive. So they were pretty run dry by the Clatsop, and by March they were pretty sick of it all, and they tried to leave early. But instead, they got caught up in another snowstorm. Just how it goes in the winter. So they were forced to retreat and stop moving forward. And then at the very end of March, they were finally able to keep on moving. And March 23rd, 1806, they stole a canoe from the Clatsop and they moved right on up the Columbia River. So they said, you know what, we had to come back, but we're taking this in exchange because we're sick of y'all and you took enough from us. So they took a canoe and they went up the Columbia River to go back to the Nez Perce and get back their horses and keep on going through the mountains. But first they had to wait for a little bit more snow to melt because, like I said, the Rockies snow more often than they don't. So in July, the expedition divides at that Three Forks in the river, the main Missouri and its 2 main tributaries. One of the bands, which was led by Lewis, was constructed of 4 men in total, and they ran into a notoriously dangerous group of Blackfoot Indians. 8 of them, in fact. They were quite literally doubled in number and probably outmanned even at an equal number. So, it led to the death, ultimately, of 2 Blackfeet. None of Lewis's men died, and because they still, I guess, outgunned these very strong and notorious warriors, Lewis himself specifically put a piece of metal around each of the 2 dead Indians' necks to get the message across to the rest of the Indians that, quote unquote, we have been here, we are the new power, and this is the new world order. Kind of ominous, but fitting for what continues to happen in history. But anyway, on September 23rd, 1806, they finally return to St. Louis and go on their own way. So what is the aftermath of the Lewis and Clark expedition all the way westward to the Pacific? Well, Lewis, being the leader, he became governor of the Louisiana territories. But being the unlucky man he is, he made more enemies than he made impacts. So that's that. And then Jefferson also requested that he write up a breakdown and an entire narrative of what he studied and what had happened, and basically create a big, long timeline and story and everything of all the discoveries and of all of his experiences. Well, Lewis never did a single word of any of that. He did not. He did not to any evidence that is found in this day and age. So instead he turned to drinking, and he fell into what Jefferson deemed a melancholia. He became financially unstable, and at the ripe age of 35, yes, that's the age that Clark left on this trip, at the age of 35, Lewis pretty much decided decided that his life was ruined, so he was gonna go overcome all this pressure by taking a trip to Washington, D.C. to clear his name and redeem himself. So along the path, they're going from St. Louis area, Missouri, somewhere in the Louisiana Territory, wherever he's staying at this point, all the way to Washington, D.C. So they had to make some stops, and at one of the camps they stopped in, his servant had heard him wander off, and then shortly after heard gunshots in the same direction. So his servant went to go look and check out what the gunshots were, and to his demise, Lewis was dead. He was shot. He was killed. Or was he killed? It's actually hypothesized that he committed suicide because I don't think his servant saw anybody, and like we said, he was in melancholia, he was drinking, his life was ruined, in shambles, he was already depressed and gloomy from the jump, and then all of this happened, all this pressure, all this hate coming his way, and so chances are Meriwether Lewis committed suicide, and that was his end. But he wasn't the only one. There was Clark, who we know was lucky in love and in life, and he, of course, lived happily ever after. He became an overall success as general of the militia, as Indian superintendent for the West. He was prosperous, influential in both of those positions. He also was supported by great friends and family, and overall he lived a pretty regular life as far as we know. Sacagawea, on the other hand, was seen in typical women's apparel in St. Louis in the year 1811, just five years after the expedition, and 6 years after the expedition. In 1812, she headed to Fort Manuel, and that is where she met her demise of typhus. And that concludes the end of the story that began westward expansion for America, westward pioneering, and secured the entire American continent and beyond the Pacific as we know it today. Thank you for listening to my presentation on the Lewis and Clark expedition.